Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to allow a couple of minutes just to let a couple of people log on this afternoon. So I hope you've got a cup of tea at the ready, maybe a biscuit or two, something to help your workload and well-being this afternoon while we have this webinar. So it's good to see those of you here. Well done for making the time. It's really hard to carve out that time for something. You put it in your diary and then you think, oh no, something else has taken over. So well done for logging on this afternoon. Just give it a couple of minutes and then I'll introduce ourselves and this afternoon's topic. Right, let's make a start. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar, Leadership Excellence Series. And this afternoon we're talking about optimising teacher workload. So my name's Kath Keast. I'm currently the Head of School Improvement within the School Improvement team at BEP. And I'm going to introduce and hand over in a moment to Brynley Evans. So once an employee of BEP, but also CEO of Penk Trust and soon to be CEO of the Haberdashers Trust from September. But I'll let Bryn introduce himself shortly. So this afternoon we're going to talk about optimising teacher workload at the same time as managing all of that so that we keep that eye on improving standards within school. And we know that managing teacher workload is one of the biggest issues that you as head teachers face. It influences your leadership, it influences your working practices, and has had a knock-on effect to retention generally within the teaching profession recently. So we hope this afternoon is going to be full of practical suggestions. We know that many of you will join this online, so welcome to those of you who are watching this as a recording. Bryn will guide us through this afternoon. He's very conscious that none of this is a silver bullet, but he's hoping to present many ideas from the wealth of his experience. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, Bryn. There will be an opportunity for Q&A. So if at the end of the session, so if you do have any questions, do pop those in the Q&A box as we go. So welcome to Bryn.
Thank you, Kath. Welcome, everybody. Just to add a little bit to the introduction, obviously my name's Brynley Evans. I have been a teacher and an educational leader now for over 30 years, including latterly a head teacher and a CEO in Staffordshire and from September in Shropshire. So as we're talking about workload, before I wanted to start with some caveats. This is an overview of workload issues. I can't cover everything, so some of the things will be sometimes general and sometimes a little bit more specific. I'm trying to get people to think about workload in slightly different ways, so trying to generate some thoughts and ideas yourself. But there will be some suggested strategies, but equally some of those will be familiar with you, and obviously the usual sort of health warning with things like webinar and training, not everything can be copy and pasted into a school because every context is slightly different. So there's no guarantee that some of the things I'm going to suggest could have worked somewhere, might work somewhere else, but equally sometimes could be of limited impact or success elsewhere. Just to give you a sort of overview of some of the things I'm going to be talking about in terms of sections. It's going to be quite wide-ranging in terms of some of the functions and schools and of teachers. I'm going to start with a little bit of sort of more theoretical ideas and thoughts, and before looking at some practical strategies that cover some of the many areas that we as educational leaders and as schools and institutions, but also teachers, get involved in. So, as is quite common and good practice, we really just need to start thinking about the rationale why teacher workload, and it is obviously important. It is self-evident in terms of those of you, and most of you will have been a teacher at some point, that you know the obvious issues there. There's also some of the obvious issues around that it is a part of Ofsted. But I really wanted to sort of go a little bit further than that, but the workload has been identified as the primary reason why many people leave the profession. And there is a considerable increase. And you know, there is lots and lots of data and lots of studies into this at the moment, but there is a considerable increase, A, in workload, and B, in the number of people who cite this as a reason for leaving the profession. And there are increasing numbers of people leaving the profession generally. It would be unfair of me to say that the government hasn't recognised this at all. They have, and you know, like the document that you can see on the right-hand side there, the workload reduction task force, and they've had previous documents at all. They are aware of it as an issue, but I would say that some of the actual the action that's actually been delivered on the ground in schools is limited. I'm not saying there isn't any at all, and of course we welcome those, and we welcome the spotlight on workload reduction, but I would still argue that it is a limited actual making a difference on the ground in our schools and in our institutions. The document there, the workload reduction task force, and there are many others. If you look up on the DfE, there are some good practical ideas in there, so they are definitely worth reading and thinking about, because they do actually suggest many practical ideas, some of which are in this webinar this afternoon. There's some that aren't, so it is definitely worth reading through those documents. I suppose we need to think about why has teacher workload increased so much? And I've got two slides here really. One is about some obvious things, and then there's a little bit of a theoretical from an academic who's looked into this. The first thing though is obviously certainly over the last 20, maybe 30 years, certainly my time in teaching, there's definitely been an increased government intervention in schools and the associated increased volume and pace of changes, new policies, curriculum, whether that's the DfE, Ofsted, all these things would be familiar. And that has definitely increased both in terms of volume, but also the pace of change. And one part of that is accountability measures, again, Ofsted, league tables, data analysis, whatever. And I think that is also partly to do that there is a lack of trust of school leaders and of teachers. And that's one of the things I'll come back to several times this afternoon, about this lack of trust. As a result, we do have a real audit culture, which it manifests itself in different ways, sometimes externally, but sometimes within our own schools and our organisations ourselves. We feel the need to check up on things because other people are coming to check up on us as well. Quite rightly, part of the workload has come through increased emphasis on school improvement and proactive leadership. You know, we're much more conscious of the need to improve our schools, and leaders are actually going at, you know, trying to put things in place that are going to improve schools. So it isn't all necessarily bad, but we still might be thinking, even though we might be doing it for good reasons to improve our schools, we still need to be thinking about the element of workload that we're imposing on colleagues, on ourselves, and our partners. I think it's also interesting in the last sort of 20 years, certainly from the last Labour government, with increased funding, there has been quite a significant increase in senior leadership roles. And again, that could be a very positive thing, that we've got, you know, head teachers have got much more support and help. Colleagues, teachers have got a lot more support from deputy heads and assistant head teachers. And there is an increase in leadership training for those new roles as well. And again, that's part of a good news story, I suppose, of trying to improve our schools and the education for our children. But as a result of that increased proactivity, those increased leadership roles and the increased leadership training, we have within schools many new initiatives. If you think about your own schools, how many new things are you putting in with CPD, coaching, curriculum, data, quality assurance, interventions, IT software? The list is endless. So many of these new initiatives are also being generated within school for good reasons, for the purpose of improving the schools, as well as the government increasing government intervention into schools. And one of the things, going back again, is this constant monitoring of teachers. But one of the criticisms I would make of that is that it's almost a one-size-fits-all, rather than differentiating our monitoring or our support or our coaching of individual teachers. Sometimes there can be a blanket approach in schools, which means that everybody needs to be monitored or checked in. I know that sometimes that is one of the things that's often cited to me by teachers when they look at the plethora of monitoring activities that can happen in schools. And I think there's a wider point as well, and this is probably increased particularly since COVID, but not just because of COVID, is the increasing expectation of what schools and teachers can do for pupils and for society. And many of the, we will all know that many different initiatives that get put into schools to try and help our children. And again, they're probably coming from a good place because we have that unique position of contact with so many children and their families and the wider community. But is it actually feasible to actually put all of these things onto schools or teachers? So that's the sort of wider context. In a sort of slightly more theoretical mode, Dr. Becky Allen, who's an educational writer and researcher, she was at the BEP conference in the autumn term, and she's written a book about teachers, and particularly about this issue of workload, and also several papers on it, Teacher Gap being her book. And she cites two researchers who looked at this issue about why there's been so much workload. And they talk about this concept of isomorphism, which sounds very grand, but it just basically means iso means the same, morphism, change or evolution. And they talk about the same change happening in organizations. In other words, we seem to be on this sort of conveyor belt towards changing our schools, and we're all doing the same thing. And that's why teacher workload is increasing. I'll just give you some examples of what they mean. They talk about three types of isomorphism, how our schools are changing. And the first one is coercive isomorphism. And basically, we as leaders are doing things because we're slightly frightened or worried about what Ofsted will think, or what the performance tables will show. So we're almost being forced to do some of these changes to increase monitoring or marking or whatever it is, because we're slightly worried of what Ofsted will think. So that is known as coercive isomorphism. We are changing our schools because we're slightly being forced to do it. The second one is that we sometimes look around and in our drive for school improvement, we look around and think, how can I improve my school? And then we look down the road at a very successful school and we think, I'd like to do that as well. And so we copy or we mimic it. And hence the second one there of mimetic isomorphism. We suddenly copy other schools. And in doing so, again, we're bringing in lots of new initiatives and ideas into our school. And the third one they call normative isomorphism, which is it's almost become the norm to think, right, we are going to have individual or personalized learning for teachers, that we are going to have progress checks. It's become the norm in our schools, and therefore we change our schools because we think everybody else is doing that, and it's become the norm in schools. And I think this concept is very, very useful to us to think we are changing our schools partly because of what the government doing, but partly because we are, as educational leaders, slightly worried or looking for answers. And so we are changing our schools, and in doing so, vastly increasing the amount of workload that we are expecting of teachers and our colleagues, and of course ourselves. So what is the effect? Why is teacher workload a problem? Well, you will obviously know that we have problems in terms of recruitment. People are put off by it, and I've obviously mentioned retention as well. Keeping people in the profession. If they're having to do 60-hour weeks, then of course some people are going to seek alternatives to that, where they can get a better work-life balance. So both recruitment and retention are severely impacted because of this issue of teacher workload. And of course, those people who are still working, it has a detrimental effect on morale or job satisfaction or well-being within their own job roles as well. But the fourth thing that I wanted to mention as well is that I've come to believe that the teacher workload is also a significant factor in school improvement. If we have too much teacher workload, our teachers cannot be effective, and therefore our schools can't improve. Or the alternative to that, if we want our schools to improve, we have to reduce teacher workload. And some of those things I'm going to touch on in there. So yes, it's about recruitment and retention. Yes, it's about looking after our colleagues, but also we are wanting to improve our schools and educational standards. And I would argue one of the most significant strategies that we can employ in our schools is to reduce teacher workload to make them more effective. So just broadening that out, I've got 5 things that I try to keep in mind in terms of leadership. There's not everything that about leadership, but it's the slightly pertinent to what we're talking about today in terms of workload. The first one is that is called servant leadership. Everybody knows that we are there to serve the community as a public service, but I also talk about servant leadership being where we as school leaders or managers are serving teachers, and we're serving teachers in all sorts of ways, making sure everything from their computers are working to the photocopiers working and so on. But also that fits into teacher workload as well. So if we as school leaders can reduce workload, make the job easier, those teachers in turn are going to be better at serving the curriculum, in delivering the curriculum, which in turn will provide the best quality education or service to our pupils. And obviously looking at that, it's quite a hierarchical model. So what I also like to do is to turn it around and say, actually, the pupils are there at the top. And we as school leaders and managers or trust leaders, we are there to try and think of as many different ways to serve our teachers, who are then serving the curriculum and serving our pupils. So for me, servant leadership is at the heart of A, school improvement, but B, potential ways to think about reducing teacher workload. The second sort of principle is an obvious one again, that teamwork is key. You know, there aren't super teachers or super head teachers or super CEOs or super anybody. Teamwork is absolutely key. John Hattie in his studies regularly cites collective efficacy amongst teachers and amongst staff in an institution as being one of the most important factors for improving standards. In my work, both as a head teacher and as a CEO, these are my last 2 mottos. One was working together, learning together, because I think whether we're talking about working or learning or functioning, it's together. So collaboration is absolutely essential. And again, thinking about workload, it's that teamwork that is an important facet in reducing workload for teachers. The third one is about prioritization, both in industry and through people like Mary Myatt. There's an increasing realization of the need to prioritize what we are doing. We can't do everything all at once. So whether we're talking Essentialism by Greg McCowan in industry, or Mary Myatt's wonderful book on Back on Track, Fewer Things in Greater Depth, we need to be thinking about doing less, but trying to pick on those things that have the most impact or are the most important to school improvement and to pupils. The next one is Kaizen, the Japanese concept of continuous improvement. We sometimes are impatient with ourselves, with our colleagues. We want change immediately, but sometimes it is a slower process, and small changes over time lead to considerable change. We almost need to be kinder to ourselves about the pace of change. Doesn't mean that we can't be demanding improvements, but rather thinking about chipping away at issues and problems rather than having a great big revolution that's going to show impact in 6 weeks. Or I also try to think about it as layers of improvement. My predecessor as a head teacher did some wonderful things. If I'm coming in as head teacher, can I add to that as layers of improvement? And you start thinking of school improvement not as something that happens in a year, not even 3 years, but maybe 5 years and above. And the last one, which I've already sort of mentioned again, is the issue of and the principle of trust. Self-determination theory says that there are 3 things that really motivate people in work. One is their relatedness or connection to people. The other is that have they got the ability or the training to be able to do the job, but also a degree of autonomy. And I think that one of the things that we have lost in education through some of the reasons that we've talked about is that lack of autonomy, partly because we're not trusting or the government is not trusting of educational professionals. So some practical ideas now, emanating from, first of all, some of those principles and then broadly going into. So the next part of the webinar is just looking at some practical things that I have seen or experienced, both as a teacher, but also as a leader. And again, just a reminder of those caveats that some of those things you will roll your eyes and go, of course, we do that already. Or some of the things you will have heard of, but not seen. And some of the things you'll think, well, that won't work, or some of the things will hopefully generate some thoughts and ideas of what you can do in your own institution. Because one of the things I am convinced about is that waiting for the government to significantly reduce teacher workload, I think we could be waiting a while. As I mentioned before, yes, there's an increased spotlight on it, but it hasn't actually materialized into changes. So I think we have a responsibility as school leaders and trust leaders to try and implement some of these changes ourselves, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because it will improve standards. So I've said here about the school leaders having having a key priority of reducing teacher workload, not because of Ofsted, not because it is the right thing to do, but also because it works. And that means also being very open about that and involving staff, but also thinking about metrics and systems to check on it, whether that's staff surveys or the like, but also making sure that governors or trustees, whatever system of governance, that is a key performance indicator. If it's important, then we should be reporting and evaluating it regularly. So in terms of prioritization, quite obviously, one of the things that we can do as school leaders is to reduce the amount of initiatives in schools. I work with a lot of schools, and it's one of the first things I talk about is reducing the amount of initiatives. Teachers frequently complain about almost the regular change, almost the shower of priorities and initiatives that are sort of forced onto them, but also the fact that they're not sustained, so they move too quickly onto something else. I recommend to head teachers something like 3 key priorities per year, maybe allocated to 1 per term. But also thinking about when you meet as school leaders, what should we reduce or stop doing? Has anyone actually put that on the agenda item rather than thinking, what else are we going to do? Or I like to think about it as the 1 in, 1 out. If we're going to bring in a new initiative, what are we going to stop doing to make time for it? And simply, the part of educational leaders when we say no. I was working with a head teacher yesterday there was a wonderful idea about nutrition and snacks in the school, but it wasn't the right time or place to be doing it. And so I was saying to the head, but you're just going to have to say no, or not at this time, something that we can do later. And also thinking about when you are bringing in new ideas or policies or priorities, what is the cost of them? And not just cost and money, but the time and the people. How much time is this going to cause for yourselves as leaders, but also the people who are going to implement it? What people, who's going to be involved in this? So trying to think about our priorities, but also some of the implications for those. I also think that as school leaders, we've got choices to make, and I frequently have this discussion with school leaders about strategic investment. Where do you want to put your money? And as you start thinking about some of the things that are often, if you like, demanded or asked, or you might think it's a good idea to do, but there's quite a lot of them, and this is just a partial list. Do we give, if we have, and I know sometimes that's not always the case, but if we do have funds to be able to invest, where do we put it? Do we give teachers, do we decrease their class allocation? Do we decrease class sizes? Do we increase leadership roles or change? Do we increase or decrease teaching assistants, pastoral staff, admin staff, or do we buy into technology? I would argue that one of the most significant on that list, not the only one, but one of the most significant one, is increasing PPA time. What I tried to do as a head teacher, unfortunately, at a time when there was, slightly more funding in education, but equally sometimes technology can be the answer through productivity, as we'll see later. But I do really think that the 10% minimum of PPA time is something that if we had the resources to, and each individual school can be different, that can be something that reduces teacher workload, but then allows teachers to be able to plan and deliver better lessons. I think the other side of leadership is about communication and organisation. Basically, well-organised schools, not only are they more effective, but they have less workload. I had a deputy head teacher who frequently used to say to me, "I can tell you some of the best subjects in the school simply because how organised they are." And I think that's also true of schools. It's about systems and routines and that attention to detail, but it's also really practical things like making sure that school calendar is planned in as much detail, looking for pinch points, that the school diary is updated and shared so everybody knows what's going on. And also a sort of thought about communication. Is it better to do some things face to face, which I really value, against sometimes having email and remote? And although technology is great, through today, through emails, some of the fantastic ways that we can meet and communicate, but sometimes it is invaluable, and I would argue actually better for teacher workload to meet face to face. The other thing I would say about meetings, I think meetings are important, but sometimes I don't think there's anything wrong with having a 10-minute meeting. They don't always have to be long. They can simply be one agenda item. We need to get together, but I think meetings sometimes we can be in danger of thinking, well, we've got an hour allocated. Let's almost use all of that time. Another aspect of schools, and which sometimes I think are, as I've said here, sometimes undervalued, and that's the business manager, office manager, or whatever title or position they have. I have seen schools that have done this very successfully. I honestly think that whoever that person is that is heading up those services should be part of the senior leadership team. They bring a different perspective to it, but it's also that they are valued. And it's all of these things that they help with that organisation that we've talked about previously, but also about deploying and managing the support staff to help with some of the teacher tasks. So I think that their role is vital to a school. The amount of work that they can do in terms of saving teacher workload with premises and equipment management, the photocopier being the obvious one, but also whether it's IT and the like. And finally, one of the things that can generate quite a lot of teacher workload is staff absence for cover. And it's an obvious thing that has to be done, but good systems and business systems in school can help with that, resulting in cover being worked out in different ways and having different systems that avoid sometimes busy teachers doing it, or the other side of it is managing and supporting colleagues back to work as soon as possible. So one of my key things is that the business management of the school, or in the case where it's a multi-academy trust, is absolutely critical if schools are going to reduce teacher workload. And a lot of this already happens, but I think that there are many schools and many trusts where we can go even further to make sure that a lot of these tasks, a lot of these supports can be even better. Another part which is one of the reasons that people sometimes leave the profession as well as workload, is the pastoral issues, and particularly behaviour. And behaviour in itself can also generate workload. So some of my thoughts about that, again, are thinking about how we can streamline our behaviour and pastoral systems so that A, that they are effective, but B, they don't necessarily pile on the work for teachers. So first of all, if there is funds available in a school, and I know that's a big if, but whether pastoral leadership and staff time can be invested in. I was fortunate in a secondary school where we were able, with heads of year, to decrease the amount of a class time allocation to them, which meant that they had more time to do the work, the pastoral work, which in turn meant that there was less for the teachers to pick up themselves. And linked to that, increasingly, particularly in secondary schools, but also within primary schools, is centralising behaviour systems through whether it's routines, procedures, rewards, all this communication, so that it doesn't just fall on individual teachers, because there are economies of scale, if you will, just within schools. Thinking about parent communication, I know that can sometimes be something that takes up a huge amount of time for teachers, whether that can be streamlined or even deployed, or whether support staff deployed to carry out some of those functions, or having pastoral leaders do it, or senior leaders, rather than it all falling to teachers. PSHE and other tutor activities can be centrally planned, and again, because a lot of teachers don't necessarily have expertise in all of the different areas of PSHE, but again, you get that efficiency in terms of teacher time. Another one for me is that is moving away sometimes from enrichment or extracurricular activities happening after school. If they are so important, and I think they are, why don't we make a period of time for them within school? They are part of the curriculum. One of the things that always frustrated me was that there were some wonderful clubs and activities after school, but very few students attended them. When we made it part of the day, when we made it part of Wednesday afternoon during school time, we had 100% attendance because they were in school time. So if we think that sport or many of these other activities are hugely important for the education of the child in the widest sense, then perhaps we need to make that time for it to happen in school time. And in terms of discipline, I think that one of the key things to remember about discipline isn't just about punishment. The word discipline actually means about teaching children about behaviour and making sure that they understand the rationale, the routines, the rules. The idea of a school charter or contract are all part of teaching children and parents about the expectations, rather than it just becoming reactive. And again, one of the things that can also help with pastoral issues and including behaviour is involving the students. The benefit for students is that they are far more involved, but also they can sometimes help. I think primary colleagues are very good at this, is getting students to be active monitors in their school. In terms of curriculum and CPD, I would say that one of the things that teachers frequently talk about is that there is too much in the curriculum, and I think they're right. But part of my response to that is also, let's move away from just looking at the content and let's look at more at some of the key concepts and ideas. So rather than it just being, I need to, in history, which is my subject, thinking I've got to talk about all the events that happened in the Middle Ages, that I focus on certain concepts that I want to get over, whether that's causation, whether that's plague, whether that's revolution, rather than thinking I have to cover all of the content. Obviously, a lot of schools now and trusts do that, which they buy and share curriculum packages, and technology really helps with that, being able to share work with each other across schools and within schools. And in terms of CPD, I think that for me, the majority of CPD time should not necessarily be in a hall or going on a training course, listening to school leaders or experts, as valuable as that can be. But the majority of time should be colleagues working with colleagues to plan and look at the work that's delivered. There's huge benefit in terms of the effectiveness of teaching as a result of that. But B, again, reduces teacher workload. And to supplement that time, I think that it's really useful to think about disaggregating training days to increase this time. So rather than thinking I've got 5 days, maybe some of those days can be added on to increase the amount of subject mastery time where teachers come together to look at specific aspects of the curriculum. And when there are whole school initiatives, thinking about them being a fairly short introduction, but then refined and implemented by specialist teachers, either in staff or subject teams. In terms of teaching, I think that one of the things that's really helpful is when school leaders provide a teaching framework. Well, obvious one is the I do, we do, you do. It doesn't necessarily in itself reduce workload, but it simplifies the process of what's being expected. Sometimes I see teachers or subject teams over planning because they think that there are certain things that school leaders or Ofsted need to see. And I would think that good quality teaching is based on a framework of principles rather than a tick list of activities. I always think the issue of PowerPoints and art is interesting. PowerPoint is a fantastic resource, great for sharing and saving things. But sometimes going back to the old-fashioned using a whiteboard, whether that's an electronic one or a good old-fashioned ordinary board, it isn't about sometimes having wonderfully planned slides. Sometimes it's responding to and scribbling on whiteboards interactively with students. Because PowerPoint is great, but I have seen some colleagues spend hours producing wonderfully looking PowerPoints when actually more thought could have been put into how they're going to respond to or ask questions in lessons. I think one of the great tools in lessons is the visualizer. Again, not necessarily having to prepare things, but responding to the work of a child together as a class. There's less preparation, but actually more interaction with students and their learning. I think sometimes underrated as well are textbooks and workbooks in order to get away from photocopying and the amount of time that is spent for that, as well as money, but also the convenience of being able to have those and get those distributed easily in classes saves time as well as money. I think an interesting idea, and it happens perhaps in other countries more, is that and again, probably more a secondary or high school issue, is where teachers are allocated to repeat lessons to different groups. So more in America, you're allocated to a certain year group and you might teach the same lesson 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And that's a wonderful way of getting real expertise, but also reducing workload. Not always possible in smaller or primary schools, but sometimes it is something that can help. I know that colleagues who've had it, who've taught the same lesson 2, 3, or 4 times, really do notice the development of their expertise by doing that. And the other issue is about homework and how we can make sure that is as slick as possible in terms of workload. And I think now with technology, I think most schools are automating or centralizing the systems, both in terms of delivery and also marking of homework. Reading. I think that everybody talks about increasing and improving reading, and I see lots of activities and silent reading and DEAR and accelerated reader and so on. I think here that one of the best ways of improving reading is simply having the low tech and low preparation mode of teachers reading aloud to children. It is wonderfully effective, both in terms of their learning to read, but also some of the enjoyment of listening to stories. And this is not exclusive to primary schools. There are increasingly secondary schools who are using this and having wonderful results with it. It has minimal planning and preparation. And there is some research evidence from the University of Sussex. It's either called Just Read or Fast Read, where the emphasis on reading the books through and the enjoyment and the progression of the narrative and the story above all else is leading to some wonderful results where all readers will increase and improve their reading, but particularly poorer readers. And there are some quite significant impacts of this. So we're talking about teacher workload, but also we're talking about impact and effectiveness. I think this one's quite a familiar one too, and I think there's been a big push here, and I think there's lots of progress. So just very quickly, just different ways of marking and providing feedback. I think the first one is that, and many people are aware of this, are just simply not having to do written checks on everything, but just verbal questioning, good, well-chosen questions that with randomly selected children, sometimes called cold calling, is one of the best ways to check understanding that doesn't involve marking. I think Ofsted, to their credit, have tried to tackle this with tackling Ofsted myths, and some of these things are the things that they're looking to eliminate: the triple marking, photographing of evidence, stamping verbal feedback. So some of the strategies that schools are using is to read samples of books rather than all of the books, finding common errors and giving class feedback, highlighting the errors but not actually annotating them, and then getting the children to correct. Using optical mark readers, those bubble, those circles that you can shade in, they are used in schools. They're coming back into fashion because you don't need the special printers anymore. They are very good ways of marking at scale and very quickly, particularly with multiple choice questions. Similarly, schools are using comparative judgments from the company No More Marking. Online quizzes, the old-fashioned paper quizzes where you just ask them questions and then they peer or self-mark it, and live marking in lessons, and the use of mini whiteboards. And there are many, many others, but I think all of those are thoughts and ideas on how we can eliminate the workload based on marking. We've sort of touched on this already, a little bit about technology. I think that technology is wonderful. We've already mentioned the value that it can have in terms of assessment. I think that most schools use Microsoft or Google as the sort of packages, particularly due to the funding through COVID. And I do think they can increase efficiency. Ways that we can help with teacher collaboration and sharing resources. But one of the big issues, I think, is that most of us are only scratching the surface for what Microsoft or Google offer in terms of the many software. So one of the things I would urge schools to do is to make sure that you train yourselves and your staff to see the many, many different aspects of Microsoft or Google. The other part, though, is, and I see this quite frequently in schools, is that there can be too many software packages. I see that some schools have a management information system, then they'll have a behavior system and an attendance system and a reward system. So there is a danger having too many. So in a desire to try to reduce workload through technology, we inadvertently increase the amount of inconvenience and workload on teachers. So think about whatever management information system you're using, rather than buying a new package to look at attendance or rewards. What does your management information system already provide? And you might be surprised at some of the things that you don't know about, rather than thinking, I need to go and get a new package. With technology, it's obviously quite fashionable at the moment to be talking about AI, and the logo there is one that's built into Microsoft, which is Copilot. And just been discussing with people that what does it actually mean? And so these are just some of the ways that we've been talking about, and actually I've started to see some of these coming into both my own practice as well as other people, about things that you can do with AI, and some of the technology is incredible, and it's only going to get more and more sophisticated. So one that we particularly use is when we're having to draft letters, particularly if it's a complex letter on a contentious issue, or that it's related to something that's quite a change. Getting the initial drafts, you'll see that a lot of these start with the word draft, because you wouldn't use AI to complete the letter, but it might give you that initial start or research or a summary, rather than it providing the final answer. Maybe that will come. I think getting close to the final part now is this part of quality assurance and accountability, and thinking about how we are going to reduce teacher workload, but at the same time, make sure that we actually know that there are standards in our schools and in our classrooms. But this has also been part where a lot of teacher workload has been increased. So I think it was David Ditto who started, amongst others, talking about intelligent accountability with our monitoring. And thinking about where is it that teachers should have autonomy and where can we trust them? And I think it's a really interesting question to think, do we need to check everything all of the time? Can we allow our, whether it's our heads of subject or our teachers, simply to get on with it, and it might be a different way of checking a sample or an average rather than thinking we have to check everything. Also thinking about the questions when we are putting in monitoring and evaluation. Why? Who for? What are we going to do with it? Will it help? What are the cost benefits of introducing this monitoring? And if we can't answer some of those questions, then would argue that we shouldn't be doing it. Does all monitoring have to be one size fits all? Could we do a sample? Should it be differentiated? All sorts of different ways of thinking, rather than thinking I have to look at all of the books from all of the teachers every week, half term. Similarly with data, and I think the government have been good on this in pushing and recommending the minimization of data drops, or that it's not replicated, or that the data analysis could be done by the leaders as opposed to the teachers, or also using technology to support with that as well. And when we are looking at reviews, I think about moving away from whether people call them deep dives, or hopefully not the dreaded mock Ofsteds, but rather thinking about them being collaborative reviews of subjects or schools. So when I do a review, I always talk about it being done with the teachers or the school leaders rather than done to them. I want to know what they think about the standards or the aspects of their school or subject, and I use that information alongside other bits of information rather than me coming in and judging from on high what they are doing in their particular work. That involvement of them means they're much more open and transparent about what the strengths and the weaknesses are, and B, it means that there is much more buy-in to any recommendations or suggestions or areas to improve as a result of those reviews because of that buy-in and involvement. Performance management, the workforce group of the government have indicated that performance-related pay and the connection with that and appraisal is to go. The question mark is still there because there's been no detail on that. And my other question is, does that mean, is that for teachers, or is that only for, or should we have appraisal for school leaders who perhaps are more accountable for standards in their school? And is it a removal of performance-related pay, which would be, I think, a step in the right direction from teachers? Similarly, Ofsted and performance tables and all that government accountability, what I think we should be doing as school and trust leaders is taking that away from teachers and moving it onto ourselves as leaders. That's our responsibility, rather than thinking that I'm going to judge somebody on a Progress 8 score or similar. And again, I would urge you to look at Ofsted myths within the Ofsted documentation about this move away from some of the things that we may have expected or thought that Ofsted are going to look at in our schools, particularly around monitoring and the use of data. So, sorry, I've just I just wanted to finish with that the last slide, reminding us about this concept of servant leadership. To my mind, what we need to be doing as leaders is serving our colleagues by taking as much work away from them so that teachers can focus on the curriculum. My job as a trust leader equally is to try and take as much work away through a trust central services from head teachers so they can focus on the curriculum. And I think if we're a head teacher or school leader, we should be thinking the same way. So some of this is a change of our perspective. What can I take away from teachers that will make them more effective? Rather than thinking I need to introduce a new initiative in order to check up or develop the teachers. There is a place for those things, but I think sometimes we may have got out of balance and out of sync between what we should be doing to support our teachers and what we're asking of them as part of our training, development, or accountability.
Fabulous. Thank you, Bryn, so much for that this afternoon. That's been really useful. It's been really great that you've rooted that in some research at the beginning and really helped us and encouraged us to think about why we're talking about this issue of teacher workload. I found that really helpful. You know, the impatient part of me is just wanting to know what are the tips, but actually that really paused my thinking today, because it's multifaceted, isn't it? That was really helpful. Thank you.
I think it's interesting to know why we've got to this position where the tasks and the activities and the workload for teachers has risen so significantly in the last 20 years. I think if we're to solve it, we need to understand it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was right and proper to do. So thank you very much. Great to learn 2 new words today, isomorphism and Kaizen being 2 of them. So thank you. I will test myself, see if I can weave those into a conversation later this evening. There's a game. I noticed Rob Meadows is on the chat, loves a game for a consortium meeting. There you go, Rob. Word of the day to see if you can weave in. There is an opportunity for some Q&A, so if anybody's got a question they'd like to ask Bryn, then do just pop it in the Q&A box down there. One question that popped into my head while you were speaking, Bryn, if you obviously work at a trust level and you work with a lot of head teachers, and I'm sure like me, those of you on the call are thinking, yes, absolutely, your priority is thinking of the workload of your staff, but if you could think of one thing that you would like head teachers to consider to perhaps talk about with their governors about managing their own well-being and workload, do you have one bit of advice?
Yeah, well, I think two bits. Servant leadership from their part, because those of us who are above head teachers should be equally thinking about taking things off head teachers. So I think servant leadership needs to be on the agenda, not just head teachers taking things away from teachers, but trust leaders, governance, trustees should all be thinking that as well. And the other one is prioritization. You know, I see too many schools trying, you know, they have improvement plans, which are, you know, there are 6, 7, 8, 10, you know, sections of improvements. And I just think that's unrealistic, and often leads to superficial change rather than, you know, as Mary Mark says, greater depth. And I think that, you know, I suppose the first thing I talk about with head teachers is, you know, when I became a trust leader was, right, let's think about 3 priorities rather than however many they may be thinking. I'm not saying there aren't many priorities, but I was talking to a head teacher yesterday and she was saying, you know, that I've got more than 3. And I said, right, so let's do 3 this year, and then 3 the following year, and 3 the following year, and then you'll have done 9 things really well in 3 years and made a real difference to the school because they will be embedded and changed. So for me, servant leadership, but also prioritization. We need to be kinder to each other, to ourselves and each other, and saying, I'm really just going to focus on this one thing up to Christmas and really get that well established. If we talk to teachers, my wife is still a teacher, and sometimes, you know, she comes home and regales me with stories about, you know, multiple initiatives at the same time and all the rest of it at the same time, teaching a full timetable and the like. And I think that's true, not everywhere, but I think it's all too common.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it brings you nicely to your final point about, you know, if it's going to help, do it. If it's not going to help, stop doing it. Yeah, take it away. So
I think having meetings where you say, right, we're going to just have on the agenda, what are we going to stop or reduce doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And in that spirit, so having billed this as a 2.5 hour session, I think we have done that for you very swiftly in an hour, thanks to Bryn. So we are helping you to manage your workload by giving you a little bit back this afternoon. But before we finish, let me just thank Bryn. Thank you very much for giving up your time. That was really helpful. I've learned a lot, and I think that'd be really useful. Thank you to many leaders. But before we finish, Claire is just going to pop in the chat. We've got 2 final of our leadership webinars before the end of the summer. So we've got one on the 2nd of July, which is about personal development, and then one on the 9th of July for early years strategies for success. And hopefully before the end of term, we are also going to be putting out the list of the 6 webinars that we have for next year. So hopefully we will have the titles of those. We've got the titles and the dates, and we will advertise those for you shortly. Okay, so without further ado, I give you permission to leave and go manage some of your workload. Tick something else off your list.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. We hope you find that useful.